So, I'm going to use the term Stadtland, or the Stadtland as the intercessor is the generic term for Jewish politics. Thus, such figures, and here I'm going to give you some names: Shimone Luzzatto and Manasseh ben Israel, Samuel Wertheimer and Moses Mendelssohn, Ber Isaac Ber and David Friedlander, Moses Montefiore and Adolph Kramer, and I'll explain who these people are later, Gabriel Reeser and Francis Goldsmith, Horace Gunzburg, and Theodor Herzl were all intercessors. The challenge is to distinguish meaningfully among them. And I would say Chaim Weizmann was an intercessor. Okay, what I'm suggesting is emancipationists and nationalists, Zionists, autonomists are all using the same methods of politics. They might say they are very different ideologically, but in fact, there are underlying structural similarities which Jewish historians should highlight. Okay, so here are the three factors I'm going to talk about. Mandate asks, who empowered the intercessor? The community, the intercessor himself or herself, or an organization, a political party? Was the intercessor an employee, full-time, part-time, contractual, or an unpaid volunteer, self-appointed? Method. Method could be divided between private and public. Private would include diplomacy, where you meet a diplomat, one person meets with a head of state or a secretary of state, backstairs lobbying, and the submission of letters and petitions. Public includes the publication of those letters, memoranda, and petitions, placing articles in the press, convening public meetings, and garnering the support of non-Jewish allies, as well as the publication of pamphlets and books. Legal status can range from individual or collective community privileges to partial or complete citizenship. These three factors will enable us to recognize different sorts of intercessors functioning in different ways at different moments. Okay? Now to part one of the paper. Okay, I'm going to talk about the emergence of three different kinds of intercessors in the 17th and 18th centuries. Okay, and this will help us to clarify terms. Okay, a typology of intercession has to begin in the 17th and 18th centuries when three new versions appeared. Okay, the first version is that of the intercessor of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Council of Four Lands. The Council of Four Lands and the Council of Lita emerged initially, beginning in 1580, as fiscal organizations designed to collect taxes for the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom. In time, the councils came to represent the Commonwealth's Jews in general. The council hired permanent Stadlanim or intercessors, permanent, with written contracts that provided regular salaries, housing subsidies, and reduced tax rates. So these were permanent employees. The council sometimes hired a Stadlan on a short-term contract for a specific mission. The Stadlan or intercessor had to have the skills and knowledge to function in the Commonwealth's political world. He had to be able to speak Latin, which was the language of the court, and Polish, which was also the language of the court, to meet with the central authority, the king, and the Polish parliament, but his power increasingly decentralized with local authorities as well. The Stadlan's methods, all conducted in the privacy of the court and officials' chambers, were threefold. First, emotional pleading, namely pleading and begging. Okay, it's very common for a Stadlan to go in and to start to cry and shout, "You're killing us," right? That was an accepted method. Second, to appeal to the community's privileges and to use legal argumentation. Say, look, we have this privilege that was given to us It guarantees us these rights. Now you're infringing or violating those rights. And third, bribery, which pervaded the Commonwealth's political life. You know, you hand somebody 10,000 zloty and they will do what you want. Very common in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, perfectly acceptable. As acceptable as in the present administration. Excuse me. The second new type, which emerged in Western Europe, was the public advocate in print who belonged to the Jewish merchant colonies or port cities in which Jews received extensive privileges verging on parity with Christians. These colonies emerged from the mid-16th century in Italy, in such cities as Ancona, Venice, and Livorno, and then spread up the Atlantic seaboard to Bordeaux and Hamburg, and finally to Amsterdam and London. For example, Simone Luzzatto, who lived from 1583 to 1663, published a famous book in 1638 called The Discourse on the Condition of the Jews, and particularly those residing in the city of Venice. His purpose was to defend Venetian Jewry's extensive privileges, the privileges that allowed them to reside and work in Venice, and which had to be renewed every decade. A scandal involving Jewish and Christian criminals who had corrupted members of the judiciary threatened the renewal. And pay attention, it was a burglary. These were burglars who included both Jews and Christians, and they had corrupted judges. Luzzatto used print to explain the Jewish merchants' singular contribution to Venice, as well as other port cities. In the long term, he initiated a tradition of Jewish political economy, but his immediate goal, at which he succeeded, was to gain the renewal of the privilege in Venice. Another example of the Stadtlerner intercessor in print was Manasseh ben Israel, who lived from 1604 to 1657, who went to London to renegotiate the readmission of the Jews to England who had been expelled in the late Middle Ages. Manasseh acted on behalf of Amsterdam's merchants who sought a way to circumvent England's navigation acts that threatened Amsterdam's position as Europe's leading commercial port. Manasseh published a tract that mixed practical commercial arguments, which he drew from Luzzatto, refutations of a variety of theological accusations against Jews, and messianic millenarian claims, which appealed to the Puritans who at that time were in power in England, Cromwell. Luzzatto and Manasseh, to come back to our criteria, had a community mandate to write tracts that aimed to defend either extensive corporate privileges or to gain admission to a society offering rights. The third example, our third example, was the court Jew. Okay, and what I'm going to argue is that the court Jew is a specifically historically limited type. Okay, court Jews created a new version of intercession in response to the Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa's 1744 edict expelling the Jews from Prague, which was one of the major urban centers of Jewish life at the time. There were as many as 20,000 Jews in Prague. The local community intercessors, the local community had intercessors who approached Maria Theresa, were laughably inept. Realizing this, the court Jews appointed themselves and circulated letters across Europe with capsules, with formulations stipulating the exact information fellow court Jews should present in order to gain the intervention of sovereigns. They went to the King of England, they went to the Estates General of Holland, governments and high-ranking ecclesiastics. They even went to the Pope, and they went to a number of cardinals and bishops, and they intervened on behalf of the Jews. The court Jews conducted a secret diplomatic campaign, shunning the kind of publicity, right? So it's private, it's not public. Shunning the kind of publicity that Protestants had employed some 12 years earlier in response to the expulsion of Protestants from Salzburg, also in the Habsburg Empire. Now, 18th century absolutism was the decisive factor here. Empress Maria Theresa acted as an absolutist monarch who was acting, in fact, against her advisors' counsel. All of her advisors told her, don't expel the Jews. It's stupid. They pay most of the taxes. But she went ahead and did it anyway. The court Jews were creatures of the new absolutist state, like Maria Theresa's, who were dependent on the sovereign. They were given individual letters of privilege, which allowed them to reside, in this case in Vienna, and to function on behalf of the empress. They could be bankrupted or dismissed, exiled, or even executed at a moment's notice. They were entirely dependent on the sovereign. Nevertheless, these Central European court Jews created a European-wide network of communications and intervention to oppose Maria Theresa that succeeded in gaining substantial diplomatic backing. Their pressure, impressive as it was, failed. The reason Maria Theresa eventually rescinded the order was because her own nobility told her, we're not going to pay our taxes unless you bring the Jews back to pay their portion of the taxes. Now, so here are these three different types of Jewish intercessors or Stadlanim who emerged in the 17th and 18th century. What I want to show now is that those three types disappeared by the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, for example, dissolved the Council of Four Lands, which had employed the intercessors or Stadlanim in 1764, as part of a general fiscal reform. The office of Stadlan, whether permanent, short-term, or contractual, disappeared. As a result, East European Jewry lost its official political representation. And numerous groups in the 19th century in Eastern Europe, Jewish groups, would compete to claim that mantle of intercession. By the Congress of Vienna, the court Jew had also disappeared. Napoleon and the Congress consolidated the over 300 German polities that were the home or spawned the court Jews into some 34. Absolutist rulers gave way to constitutional monarchs, and Jews became private bankers with citizenship rights, whether partial or complete. They were no longer dependent on these individual letters of privilege. Let's take the most famous example. The Rothschilds. Who's heard of the Rothschilds? Right? Okay. The Rothschilds were the quintessential court Jews for many. In fact, the Rothschilds were not court Jews. They made the transition to being private bankers while advocating for emancipation privately. The Rothschilds increasingly organized funds for states rather than for individual rulers. They floated loans through bond sales on the stock market. Beginning in 1818, there was a Prussian bond placed on the English capital market. Moreover, the Rothschilds' legal status was increasingly independent of rulers. None of these letters of individual privileges. The Habsburg Emperor, for example, ennobled Amschel and Solomon in 1816 and in 1819 gave them the title Honorary Consul. Now, since the court Jew effectively ceased to exist after 1815, the term is inapplicable for subsequent periods. Henry Kissinger was not a court Jew. Henry Kissinger was what I would call a policy Jew. It's the Jewish expert functioning in a democracy that values expertise that brought him to the White House as National Security Advisor and then made him Secretary of State. Intercessors continued to engage in private diplomacy of various sorts based on personal access, but they were no longer court Jews employed by, with a personal privilege from, and precariously dependent upon an individual ruler, right? Their legal status was totally different, even if the methods remained similar. Similarly, the representatives of merchant colonies, the advocates in print, also disappeared. They advocated for and in fact succeeded in gaining equal rights or citizenship. The most salient example, and this is what I discussed in my lecture last year, was Bordeaux's delegation to the Revolutionary National Assembly in France in January of 1790. After the National Assembly deferred the question of rights for Jews on December 23, 1789, the delegation from Bordeaux rushed to Paris to seek political rights. They submitted a memorandum to the Constitutional Committee arguing that their privileges, originating in the 16th century but confirmed in 1723 explicitly for them as Jews, had been renewed from reign to reign, and that on the basis of those privileges, they deserved admission to citizenship. Talleyrand's Constitutional Committee adopted that very argument, and the Assembly's Edict of 1790 gave the Bordeaux Jews political rights on the basis of their existing privileges. Okay? So, those three types all disappear in the 19th century. Now we come to the second part and the emergence of a new kind of intercessor, the citizen intercessor. As early as the Revolutionary period, but certainly in the 19th century, a new type of intercessor appeared, the citizen intercessor. The citizen intercessor possessed partial or full rights, no longer privileges, and could act in opposition to the government by claiming full rights, or once possessed of rights, in accord with or in opposition to it. Okay, what's important to see is that the citizen intercessor, because of citizenship, could actually oppose his own government, and in fact did. He could be either self-appointed, the mandate, a self-appointed mandate, or start that way, or have a community's mandate. The citizen intercessor's prestige often derived either from professional success or from serving in public office, as well as in the organized Jewish community. What we'll see is that intercessors, citizen intercessors, were often lawyers, journalists, people who already had prestige and recognition in the larger world. Setting him apart from earlier, he employed the citizen intercessor employed the established methods of quiet diplomacy, lobbying and submitting private petitions and memoranda. Setting him apart from earlier intercessors, setting him apart from the earlier Stadtlohn, or the court Jew, but continuing the practices of the advocate in print, was his use of the new means of public politics, meetings, petitions, and above all, the press, which became a major force in the 19th century, newspapers, the general press and the Jewish press. A Jewish press developed in Europe from the late 1830s and became a major public presence. Hand in hand with public politics went the pursuit of alliances with other individuals and groups, whether religious groups or secular, political, or humanitarian groups. To consider a few examples, okay, and this goes back to that list of names I read to you in the beginning. In response to his career in law being blocked because of his religion in his hometown of Hamburg, Gabriel Rieser, who lived from 1806 to 1863, chose to conduct a public campaign for emancipation as a juridical and constitutional question. He first published a militant essay, right? He goes public, in which he accused the German states of illegal inconsistency in offering partial emancipation or partial rights. Emancipation for him was a juridical issue of equal rights in exchange for equal duties. He subsequently published a journal provocatively called The Jew, in German Der Jude. And you have to remember, the term Der Jude, or the Jew, was a pejorative. Jews and governments at the time started to use euphemisms like Israelite or of the Mosaic persuasion in order to avoid that pejorative. So publishing a journal with that title was, in fact, truly provocative. He aimed to promote emancipation through that journal in two ways. First, by disseminating precise knowledge about the Jews' legal status in the multiple states. There were 34 different German states at that time. And second, by organizing associations in every German polity comprised of Christians as well as Jews to engage in the legal struggle. He debated opponents of emancipation publicly, in the press, and in person. Rieser at first appointed himself an advocate of emancipation. He was self-appointed. Later, Jewish communities commissioned him to work on their behalf. So he then had the mandate of communities. Another example, Adolph Kramer, who lived from 1796 to 1880, similarly started as a self-appointed intercessor. A celebrated lawyer, he successfully represented Jews in his hometown in the south of France who objected to swearing the discriminatory oath that Jews had been required to take since 1809. He published two famous pamphlets on the subject. By 1830, he was a member of the Central Consistory, the central organization of Jews in France, in Paris. By 1834, the vice president, in which capacity he wrote the consistory's official memoranda to the government. And we'll see that later, in 1860, he becomes one of the founders of one of these first new Jewish organizations in France, the Alliance Israélite Universelle. Okay. Now, having mentioned the organized Jewish community, the consistory in Germany, the Gemeinde. Oh, okay, one more. Sorry, I missed a paragraph. In England, let's take one more example in England. It was the notables, Isaac Lyon Goldsmith, David Solomons, who felt the degrading stigma of inequality of disabilities, who initiated the struggle for political rights. This was after 1828 when the Catholics had gained equal rights. Only in the late phases did the Board of Deputies, the community organization, and various synagogues create an actual campaign. In fact, that campaign helped the Board of Deputies become a more effective organization. Moreover, the campaign succeeded because of a combination of alliances. Jewish leaders held numerous meetings and corresponded with the highest government officials. And they did so privately. At the same time, they gained the support of various associations, political parties, writers, and newspapers who advocated on their behalf. Now, having mentioned the organized Jewish community, whether the consistory, the consistoire in France, the Gemeinde in Germany, or the Board of Deputies in England, it's imperative to note that while primarily religious in character, those organizations waged a tenacious struggle for equality or emancipation throughout the 19th century. The French consistoire, for example, took the lead in the 4-year campaign to block the renewal of Napoleon's infamous decree, discreetly lobbying the government and publishing petitions, including a scorching attack in 1818 in which it called Napoleon's decree, quote, one of the most odious acts of despotism, a true atrocity. That is not weak language. It orchestrated the decades-long campaign against the special Jewish oath involving a boycott by virtually all rabbis. It also led the effort to gain rights for Algeria's Jews, and Algeria was incorporated into France after 1830. Two events of the 1850s illuminate the character of 19th century intercession. And here we're going to switch. One of these examples takes us to Eastern Europe. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that we have to look across Europe. We can't divide Europe into East and West and say Jewish politics were one way in the West and another way in the East. In fact, it was a continuum. The first of these events occurred in St. Petersburg in the late 1850s, almost 3 decades after the Council of the Four Lands dissolution. Jews had mobilized in an unprecedented fashion to press their case during the 4-year parliament from 1788 to 92, holding elections and sending representatives. In the 19th century, all the emerging factions laid claim to being representatives of the Jews. In Congress Poland in the 1820s and 40s, for example, a series of Hasidic rebbes emerged as intercessors. Isaac Kallis of Warka, who lived from 1779 to 1848, for example, submitted petitions in Polish that displayed carefully crafted legal arguments that exploited an exact knowledge of administrative procedures. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here is even Hasidic rebbes participated in this process of intercession, using the same kinds of methods that the citizen intercessors used. Okay? And in Tsarist Russia, the Maskilim, or Jewish enlighteners, as self-appointed intercessors, tried to forge an alliance with the government by submitting petitions and publishing tracts advocating regeneration through reforms of occupations, education, and dress. Now, beginning in 1854, a group of wealthy Jewish merchants appointed themselves Russian Jewry's new leaders, the new intercessors. They began to submit petitions to the government requesting that it grant privileges to selected groups of Jews who had obvious utility for the state. The Tsar, Alexander II, who was then engaged in the great reforms, including the emancipation of the serfs, accepted these proposals and created the policy of selective integration of Jews. Thus, from 1856, Jewish doctors were employed in state institutions, including the army. Merchants of the first guild, the wealthiest merchants, and university graduates gained the privilege of free residence throughout the Russian Empire. It meant they could leave the Pale of Settlement and live anywhere in Russia. In 1864, Jews were admitted to the civil service, especially the judiciary. And in 1865, most importantly, the government extended the privilege of free residence to all certified artisans. And the Tsarist government thought that for Jews, allowing artisans to live anywhere was the equivalent, was equivalent to emancipating the serfs. Here was an example of self-appointed intercessors gaining themselves and some fellow Jews a version of equality possible in Tsarist Russia. The second event, and here we go to Italy, was the case of Edgardo Mortara in Bologna in 1858. Edgardo Mortara was a child, Jewish child in Bologna, who had allegedly been baptized as an infant, who was then kidnapped by the papal authorities and raised in the church. Three distinct forms of intercession were on display protesting his kidnapping and the church's refusal to release him. First, James Rothschild in Paris and Lionel Rothschild in London interceded by sending letters to the Vatican Secretary of State with whom they had had previous dealings. Here was the method of private diplomacy, right? Rome's Jewish community, which had limited privileges at the time, interceded with the Pope and the Vatican as humble supplicants. Roman Jewry's representatives employed detailed arguments from canon law to support Edgardo's release. Here was a corporate community's discreet private intercession as supplicants. In marked contrast, the Jews of Piedmont in the north of Italy had gained emancipation, equal rights in 1848, and retained them. After an emergency meeting in Alessandria, the major city in Piedmont, the Piedmontese Jewish leaders disseminated news of the kidnapping to Jewish communities across Europe and abroad. They went public, placed articles in the Jewish and general press, and called for public support. Here, citizens mobilized publicly. Okay. Now, one other phenomenon is worth mentioning, and I'm going to mention it briefly, which is Jews across Europe in the 19th century were elected to office. They were elected to municipal offices, to regional state offices, and also to national office. Okay, we usually think that Jews didn't participate in government in Europe. It's not the case. Okay? Particularly at the local and municipal level. Jews were involved in government beginning in the 1780s, even in Russia. Catherine the Great allowed Jews to participate in municipal politics beginning in 1785, and Jews were elected mayors of various cities. It started in Prussia in 1808. It continued in Posen in the 1830s. The first Jew elected to the Hungarian parliament served for Mór Vármán, served for almost a quarter century, etc., etc. And those individual Jews elected to office, not by other, often not by other Jews, often by Christians, would actually act as individuals on behalf of Jewish rights in that capacity. For example, Gabriel Rieser, whom I mentioned, was elected to the National Assembly during the 1848 Revolution. He was elected second vice president of the National Assembly, and he defended rights for Jews. And this happened elsewhere as well. Adolph Kramer, whom I mentioned, served a number of times as Minister of Justice in the French government. The last time he served in that capacity in 1870, he signed the actual edict giving the Jews of Algeria equal rights, the so-called Kramer Decree. Okay, so much for the Citizen Intercessor, part 2. We now come to part 3, and the transformation of Jewish politics at the end of the 19th century. Jewish politics entered a new phase in the last third of the 19th century in response to the mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe, from Russia, Galicia, and Romania, and the organized political anti-Semitism that aspired to restrict or revoke the Jews' equal rights. In keeping with the general expansion of civil society, Jewish citizens founded two new types of voluntary organizations. First, they established social welfare organizations in Western and Central Europe that created new mandates for politics, for intercession. Second, they established civil defense organizations in Central and Eastern Europe that created new mandates and introduced new methods, especially litigation. Moreover, in keeping with the general expansion of politics, Jews began to establish political parties across Europe. In consequence, intercession shifted from the individual citizen intercessor and the religious community to emissaries of a voluntary organization or a political party. Now, the Allianz Israelite Universelle, that organization that Kramer was associated with, founded in 1860, was the mother organization of all of these welfare and civil defense organizations in combining the two functions of defense of emancipation with social welfare. It was the first permanent and self-contained institution dedicated to promoting emancipation everywhere. The Allianz took the form of a philanthropic or missionary society. The Allianz promoted regeneration through schools and interceded using publicity and moral argumentation. The Allianz is most famous for creating a network of hundreds of schools across North Africa and the Middle East. In fact, the Allianz started out wanting to create schools in Eastern Europe, but the Tsarist government wouldn't allow it to do so, so it turned its attention to North Africa and the Middle East. The new welfare organizations, and here I'll just rattle off the names and dates: the Anglo-Jewish Association, founded in 1871, the Allianz in Vienna, 1873, the Jewish Colonization Association, 1891, the Aid Society of German Jews, 1901, the Jewish Women's League, 1904, and one that you're probably familiar with, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid and Sheltering Society, HIAS, founded in 1909, developed mass philanthropy on an unprecedented scale. These philanthropic organizations adopted a three-pronged strategy. First, they pursued emancipation or equal rights, negotiating with governments and bringing pressure through the press. The Aid Society of German Jews director Paul Nathan, for example, negotiated with the governments of Russia, Romania, and Bulgaria for rights. Second, the welfare associations promoted regeneration through education. I've mentioned the Allianz's schools in North Africa and the Middle East. The Allianz of Vienna established a network of schools in Galicia. Galicia was, of course, the backwater of the Habsburg Empire, the area of Poland that the Habsburg Empire had taken in the three partitions in the late 18th century. Finally, the welfare organizations protected the migrants from Eastern Europe and minimized their impact on the countries of transmigration. Paul Nathan, for example, used the press to convince the major shipping lines to permit representatives of the Aid Society of German Jews to be present at the border stations as the migrants crossed into Germany to protect their rights, as well as to provide better services, including kosher food. Jews established civil defense organizations that conducted litigation in the three empires that aspired to be a state of law. Okay, if you think about the American Jewish Committee using lawyers, or the Anti-Defamation League using lawyers, that is not an American Jewish invention. That was invented by European civil defense organizations at the end of the 19th century. The American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League were imitating their European predecessors. In Austria, Hungary, and Germany, the organizations were expressly designed to defend a newly minted equality against the even newer opponent of political anti-Semitism. The Austrian Israelite Union, founded in 1886, proclaimed, I quote, "The organization sees its task as safeguarding the general and political rights of the Jews and helping to guarantee those rights to those practicing the Jewish religion." Its Legal Defense Bureau, founded in 1897, brought libel suits and defended forcibly baptized minors, primarily in Galicia. It also intervened to block discriminatory legislation. The Central Association of German Jews of the Jewish Persuasion, founded in 1893, asserted the need to mount a public campaign to defend equality with all available legal means. Quote, "As citizens, we neither need nor demand any protection beyond our legal rights." There was a similar organization in Russia. The lawyers who, after 1893, staffed Russia's Society for the Promotion of Enlightenment Among the Jews, opened a defense bureau that supplied legal assistance to victims of pogroms who sought government reparations, and to defend the victims of blood libel trials. Remember the so-called Bayless trial? The lawyers who defended him were from the Society for the Promotion of Enlightenment Among the Jews. The Society, in addition, established a press bureau in Russia, but with a branch in Berlin, publicity, to disseminate information at home and abroad about persecution and discrimination. Through broad membership, the civil defense organizations created their own mandate to utilize the public methods of law and the press, as well as diplomacy. The formation of political parties similarly altered intercession. Earlier in the century, Jews had divided over the nature of Judaism, Orthodox versus Reform, and emancipation, for emancipation, against emancipation. At the end of the century, they fractured into a complex political matrix in which parties competed among themselves, but also with the voluntary organizations, the welfare organizations that were, at least initially, better organized and better funded. All the parties employed similar private and public methods of intercession. The difference was the internal claim to a mandate. The nationalists asserted that their congresses, conferences, and elections constituted a democratic basis for political action, in contrast to what they saw as the autocratic manner and oligarchic composition of the social welfare and civil defense organizations, as well as the emancipationist political parties. For example, Theodor Herzl began as a self-appointed citizen intercessor with entree to philanthropists and heads of state because he was a well-known journalist. He wrote for the main Viennese liberal journal. It was the Neue Freie Presse, which was sort of the New York Times of its day. And he was also the well-known author of numerous plays and of his tract about the Jewish question called The Jews' State, right? That book that's always called The Jewish State, that's a mistranslation. The original German is Der Judenstaat. It's the Jews' state. Herzl wasn't interested in Jewish, he was interested in Jews. From the first Zionist Congress in 1897, Herzl functioned as the head of a political party that purported to represent the Jews as a nation. Zionists at first cooperated with the social welfare and civil defense organizations. In 1906, after the bruising debate over Uganda and Herzl's death, the Congress adopted a platform of work in the present that endorsed emancipation and national minority rights alongside the democratization of the organized communities. Like Zionists, autonomists or diaspora nationalists, with Shimon Dubnov in the lead, also claimed to speak for Jews as a non-territorial or spiritual national minority. The General Jewish Labor Bund in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, the so-called Bund, also organized in 1897, advocated for workers. Agudat Yisrael, the Aguda, organized in 1912, represented Torah true or Orthodox Jews. And in the name of defending emancipation, the Austrian Israelite Union, which I've mentioned, and the Central Association of German Citizens of the Jewish Persuasion participated in elections by endorsing and funding candidates opposed to the candidates of the anti-Semitic political parties. Jews now began to gain elected office as representatives of Jewish political parties, no longer as individuals who then acted as intercessors, but as representatives of political parties. This was especially the case in East Central and Eastern Europe, in Galicia and the Bukovina, Congress, Poland, and Russia. These politicians relocated intercession to the parliamentary system and interceded on behalf of a particular ideology and constituency. For example, in Russia, Jews of all the political parties, the autonomists, the Zionists, the Bundists, and Jews from the liberal parties, created a union for the attainment of full equality for the Jewish people in Russia in 1905. And that union, in fact, sent a delegation of representatives representing all parties to intervene with the Russian Prime Minister in 1905 to make sure that Jews were given the vote along with everybody else, because the Russian government was thinking of giving the franchise to everyone except the Jews, and they succeeded in getting it. Okay. Now, all of these organizations and parties competed at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919-20, where Jews were the representatives of minority rights. All the parties and groups used the same methods of private diplomacy and public politics, including forming organizations designed specifically to function at the peace conference itself. Jewish intercessors aimed to secure emancipation, civil and political rights, and national minority rights, hoping that signed treaties would obligate the successor states, the states which emerged after the collapse of the dual monarchy, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Austria, will obligate those successor states to be inclusive nationality states rather than exclusive nation states. In addition, the intercessors faced the new issue of statelessness as some of the successor states disowned Jews of the former empires. To conclude, I've used the three criteria of mandate, method, and legal status rather than ideology to assess intercession. We have examined the early modern period's three new forms of intercession, namely the Council of Four Lands Stadtland, the Merchant Colonies, Advocate in print, and the Central European Court Jew. All three vanished by the 19th century. We've seen the advent of the Citizen Intercessor, who either self-appointed or representing a community, added the public politics of notables and advocacy in print to private diplomacy on behalf of emancipation. We have seen how at the end of the century, new institutions, welfare societies, civil defense organizations, and political parties transformed intercession by becoming the source of mandates and new methods. These shared institutions, which ranged across the political spectrum, came to dominate Jewish politics. In sum, I hoped that today we have taken a few steps towards delineating a new typology of Jewish politics in the long 19th century. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.